This episode was recorded before a federal appeals court in DC upheld the federal ban on TikTok. To follow the Knight Institute's commentary on the case, please visit our website and follow us on social media.
We need to take a close look at whether TikTok poses a national security risk.
While many consider TikTok to be just another video sharing app, in reality, TikTok has been functioning as a massive surveillance program.
TikTok is a weapon by the Chinese Communist Party to spy on you, manipulate what you see, and exploit for future generations.
On April 24, 2024, President Joe Biden signed a law that could lead to the ban of the popular social media app TikTok.
I just signed into law the national security package that was passed by the House of Representatives this weekend and by the Senate yesterday. It's going to make America safer. It's going to make the world safer.
ByteDance, TikTok's Chinese owner, has until early next year to shutter the app or sell.
This is not an attempt to ban TikTok. It's an attempt to make TikTok better.
The clock is ticking for TikTok. They've chosen to go to court.
The law before this court is unprecedented, and its effect would be staggering.
So what happens if time runs out? This is Views on First, speech on the border at the frontiers of censorship and surveillance. I'm Rami Krishnan, a lawyer at the Knight First Amendment Institute. The Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary-Controlled Applications Act gives TikTok's owner ByteDance until January 19, 2025 to divest from the app or see it banned. It also empowers the president to force the sale of other so-called foreign adversary-controlled apps if he deems them to be a national security risk. Congress passed the act, citing concerns the Chinese government could use the app to retrieve sensitive information about American users and to spread propaganda. But restricting access to foreign media is the kind of action we normally associate with authoritarian regimes, not democracies like ours. So how did we get here? Well, it goes back to the summer of 2020.
And boy, that summer had been a bad one for the president on TikTok.
This is Anupam Chanda, a law professor at Georgetown University Law Center and an expert on the global regulation of new technologies. In the summer of 2020, Anupam says that Trump was
being ridiculed left and right on TikTok. Sarah Cooper, a comedian, during the pandemic used his own words and lip-synced, and just by using his words, she showed how crazy he was, essentially. And so she would do these hilarious 15-second, 30-second spoofs of Trump using his own words.
Proposals to ban TikTok date back a little further than 2020. In 2019, the Committee for Foreign Investment in the U.S. began investigating ByteDance's acquisition of the American app Musical.ly, spurred by fears that the app's merger with TikTok would facilitate Chinese access to U.S. user data. The thrum of calls to ban TikTok began to build then, but it was in 2020 that the idea really began to pick up steam. By this point, Cooper's imitations of Trump had received millions of views and likes from TikTok users. In fact, she was so popular that in August 2020, a Vogue magazine headline asked, "Is Sarah Cooper the real reason Donald Trump wants to ban TikTok?" But Cooper wasn't the only TikTok user to attract Trump's ire.
The BTS army, K-pop teenagers, spoiled a rally that he was having in Tulsa, Oklahoma, by reserving seats at that rally, causing him to crow that he had 1 million people who wanted to attend, but that when he actually arrived, all the seats were empty because the teens had foiled that rally.
Dang it, I accidentally went to the Trump website and reserved 2 spots at the Tulsa, Oklahoma Trump rally. And I can't go because I have to walk my gecko that day. It'd be a really horrible shame if more people did this.
As one longtime Republican strategist and critic of Trump tweeted at the time, quote, "The teens of America have struck a savage blow to the president."
So TikTok was really, really super annoying to the president. And also, the other thing is, look, there were other people all over Facebook and Twitter and YouTube criticizing Trump. But all those apps he had mastered. That is, he gained a ton from all the other platforms. There wasn't a really vocal contingent of Trump supporters on TikTok in 2020. So there was only an upside to banning this foreign app. At the same time, he could claim that he was protecting America from foreign influence, from Chinese influence. During the 2020 campaign, I want to remind people, he literally said he was standing between Americans and their children having to learn Chinese.
As the Trump administration publicly mulled a ban, domestic tech companies that had resisted other forms of regulation largely stood silent. Two of the largest companies, Meta and Google, were likely thrilled to see a major rival in the government's crosshairs. Meanwhile, ByteDance, sensing the way the winds were blowing, tried to address the administration's concerns by hiring an American CEO. But it didn't matter. In August 2020, Trump issued a pair of executive orders that would ban TikTok from operating in the US within 90 days unless ByteDance sold the app first. Here's then Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin.
TikTok cannot stay in the current format because it risks sending back information on 100 million Americans.
But even as American companies entered the race to buy the app, TikTok went to court. Trump had issued the ban under IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Although the statute gives the president broad authority to regulate international commerce when he declares a national emergency, it also contains important exceptions to guard against the risk of abuse. For example, the president can't use his powers under IEEPA to limit the cross-border exchange of information and ideas. The courts put Trump's ban on hold because it violated this exception. When Biden took office, some experts like Anupam thought that the looming threat of a TikTok ban would be a thing of the past. And for a little while, that appeared to be true. Biden rescinded Trump's executive order. TikTok continued negotiating with the Committee on Foreign Investment over ways to mitigate the government's national security concerns. And though there were proposals to ban TikTok here and there in Congress, they never made it very far. Until 2023.
What happened was that on October 7th, 2023, there was the Hamas terror attack on Israel, a massive attack that caused many in the world to worry about what was happening in Israel. And then concerns that in November, in Congress, that American youth were turning against Israel in the wake of that October attack. And that was due to, they believed, TikTok, which was promoting Palestinian voices to the detriment of Israeli voices on the app. And that caused many people in Congress to say, hey, let's do something about this. And many have already been trying to ban TikTok. And this, by all accounts, I mean, you look at the accounts in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, they all agree on this, that the ban efforts, which had been faltering, were now revived.
While print media in the US has often described the war in Israel and Gaza in relatively sterile terms, social media has been flooded with videos showing the aftermath of Israeli airstrikes on hospitals, schools, and refugee camps. No persuasive evidence has been presented to suggest that TikTok, or any other platform for that matter, is rigging its algorithm in favor of pro-Palestinian speech. And TikTok has vehemently denied allegations of anti-Israel bias. But that hasn't allayed fears, especially among lawmakers, that China could be manipulating Americans on the app.
Some wonder why there was such overwhelming support for us to shut down potentially TikTok or other entities of that nature.
This is Republican Senator Mitt Romney explaining the bipartisan consensus to ban TikTok.
If you look at the postings on TikTok and the number of mentions of Palestinians relative to other social media sites, it's overwhelmingly so among TikTok.
This is a startling admission, and it begs the question, how real are the government's national security concerns about TikTok anyway?
not a sparkling Gen Z tech native when it comes to TikTok.
This is Meredith Whittaker, the president of the Signal Foundation. Signal is an open source messaging app that uses end-to-end encryption. It's used by journalists and activists the world over to avoid the prying eyes of governments. While Meredith isn't personally on TikTok, she's been a major advocate for ethics in tech. In 2018, after working at Google for 12 years, she helped organize a wave of employee walkouts over the company's handling of sexual harassment allegations. She and many others also demanded that Google pull out of Project Maven, a military contract that used the company's AI to analyze drone strike footage. She ultimately resigned and then later took the helm of Signal in 2022. Meredith is deeply critical of the business model of TikTok and the other big tech companies.
I am certainly not one to push back on the fact that I think most of these social media platforms are trash. They're not a great way to form a cohesive information ecosystem.
But she also fears giving the executive branch a powerful new tool to bend tech platforms to its will.
I think if we look particularly at national security designations like foreign adversary controlled, which I believe was coined for this bill, we see a history of, on the one hand, judicial deference to the executive branch. So once someone is labeled with that appellation, it is unlikely they will persevere in removing that label. And it's unlikely that the courts will listen to them. The deference to the executive is more or less the rule.
The executive branch has abused its power to make national security designations before. Meredith mentions the example of the Holy Land Foundation, a Muslim charity that was shut down and designated a terrorist organization in the wake of 9/11. While the organization was prosecuted and found guilty of providing material support for terrorism, the case was controversial at the time and is now viewed by many as an effort by the Bush administration to intimidate advocates for Palestinian self-determination. The problem doesn't stop at designations, however. As we've explored in earlier episodes, there is a long history of the government invoking national security as a pretext, including to restrict Americans' access to information and ideas. Anupam points to the Pentagon Papers case from the 70s.
The question in that case, still around the Vietnam War, is whether or not the New York Times can publish the Pentagon Papers, that is, this secret history of the Vietnam War that the Pentagon had produced.
The Washington Post was also suing for the right to publish this tranche of documents. In his dissent in the case, Justice Harry Blackmun observed that publication of the papers could result in, quote, the death of soldiers.
Which is a pretty striking claim. And it's, to me, still endlessly surprising that the Supreme Court said, well, even if the government says soldiers will die, we don't really take that at face value. And historians, I think, now say this was largely an effort not to protect American soldiers, but to prevent the American government from embarrassment, because it had waged this really terrible war for the last decade under often false pretenses and with horrific consequences for Vietnamese and Americans and the world, right? So again, this effort to invoke national security to protect against the release of information to the American public, when in fact it was really to protect the government and its preferred viewpoints that should be circulated in the country.
TikTok's challenge to the ban is currently before a federal court of appeals in D.C. What does Anupam make of the national security claims the government has made in that case? He's less than impressed.
The Assistant Director of National Intelligence, Casey Blackburn, begins his statement, his declaration. First, while we have no information that the PRC has done so with respect to the platform operated by TikTok United States, there is a risk that the PRC may coerce ByteDance or TikTok to covertly manipulate the information received by millions of Americans that use the application every day through censorship or manipulation. Second, there is a risk that the PRC may coerce ByteDance or TikTok to provide the PRC access.
He's referring to access to sensitive US user data. The next several paragraphs of the statement are redacted, a feature of much of the government's evidence. But Anupam says the important point is this.
Our intelligence services say they haven't done this. There is no evidence that the PRC has compelled, manipulated this app, information on the app, or that it has collected information on Americans through the app. So all that redacted stuff is conjecture about what's possible in the future.
It's not just that the government's claims rely on speculation. It's that banning TikTok wouldn't effectively address its concerns. It won't address data collection concerns because China could still obtain sensitive data about Americans in other ways. It can hack the databases of American companies and government agencies as it's done in the past. It can collect the data from third-party websites, and it can purchase data from data brokers, though a recently enacted law might limit that ability. Banning TikTok also won't address Congress's concerns about content manipulation. That's because China could still run disinformation campaigns on American-owned platforms, much like Russian operatives did in the 2016 election. Anupam also finds it striking that the government doesn't address Project Texas, TikTok's plan to address the government's concerns about data security and content manipulation on the app. What the plan essentially said is this.
Hey, we're going to hive off all personal data and the algorithm under a particular new company. And that company is going to have directors who are subject to the approval of the US executive. The directors are going to be people who have or are capable of having national security clearance. Okay, and they're American citizens. Those people would be in charge of this new entity that controls all that data, the personal data of Americans and the recommendation algorithm. All of that would sit on Oracle infrastructure.
That is, infrastructure that is located in the US. Anupam says the government hasn't addressed why those guardrails aren't sufficient. All of this wouldn't matter if this wasn't a First Amendment case. And that's essentially the argument that the government makes. That the ban is a regulation of TikTok's foreign ownership, not Americans' ability to speak or listen on the platform. And so the First Amendment has nothing to say. Here's government attorney Daniel Tenney.
The government isn't targeting those people, isn't saying, we don't want you to be able to post on this medium, we don't want you to be able to associate. That's just something that happened to them.
But as we've explored in the series, the Supreme Court has long recognized that the First Amendment protects the right of Americans to receive information and ideas from abroad. This is true even though foreign speakers themselves may lack First Amendment rights. In fact, in a case from the 60s called Lamont versus Postmaster General, the court held that Americans have a right to receive information from abroad, even when the government considers that information to be foreign propaganda. Here's Anupam again.
Congress had a law that required postmasters across the country to retain in the post office any mail coming from communist countries, basically communist propaganda, and then write to the intended recipient asking, hey, Mr. Lamont, we see that you've received a copy of the Peking Review. Would you indeed like to have this delivered, or would you like us to destroy it?
If Lamont wanted to receive the Peking Review, he would have to tell the US Postal Service in writing. The Supreme Court held that the law violated Americans' right to receive information. Although the law did not deny Americans access to any material, the court believed it would exert a powerful chilling effect. How many Americans would be willing to inform the government, at the height of the Cold War no less, that they wish to receive communist propaganda from China? A TikTok ban is considerably more onerous than the law at issue in Lamont. Not even the government argues that everything on the app is propaganda. It doesn't even argue that TikTok's algorithm has already been hijacked, only that it could be. And of course, the ban doesn't just impose a registration requirement. It imposes, well, a ban. This isn't to say that the government is powerless to act in the face of foreign manipulation. It can make the case to the American public that China is using TikTok to spread disinformation. If it presents credible evidence of manipulation, perhaps fewer Americans will use it. It can also require the social media companies to share data with researchers and to share basic information about their content moderation practices with the public. The basic problem, after all, isn't TikTok per se. It's that any of these companies can hoover up our data and shape public debate through algorithms that we can't see, much less understand. Meredith Whittaker from Signal agrees.
Like, the issue here isn't TikTok. The issue here is a paradigm of a shared information ecosystem that shapes our shared reality, that is based on mass surveillance, based on a homogeneous platform infrastructure, and controlled by for-profit companies. Like, there is no world in which for platforms controlling what billions of people see and know is not a tempting political lever. But the singling TikTok out is, particularly kind of has a xenophobic edge, and wasn't really on the agenda until deep anxiety around TikTok's role in shaping youth opinion around Gaza came to the fore.
In other words, if Congress is really worried about protecting Americans' privacy or countering foreign manipulation, it doesn't make any sense to focus only on TikTok. We need a more holistic approach.
What I'm not comfortable with there is claiming that, the only threat is TikTok. The 4 other US-based platforms that have the same capabilities and a massive head start on TikTok in terms of gathering sensitive information, in terms of the potential to manipulate. So I'm all for pushing back on the surveillance business model, pushing back on ad-based targeting as the paradigm of, surveillance ad-based targeting is the paradigm and economic engine of our tech industry. Like, I think these things are toxic. I think in large part they are irredeemable. So, amen.
Unfortunately, the kinds of regulations we need, a comprehensive data privacy law, for example, and better transparency requirements, seem like they're on the back burner. Meanwhile, TikTok continues to stare down the barrel of a ban. So how likely is it that the ban actually goes into effect? It's difficult to say. The DC Circuit heard arguments in TikTok's challenge to the ban on September 16, 2024. When we recorded this episode in November, a decision was still pending, but it doesn't look good. Despite the plethora of statements by legislators pointing to the true motivation for the ban, the judges who heard the case seemed to credit the government's national security concerns.
I think what they're saying is TikTok Inc. may well have First Amendment rights and does, but TikTok Inc. can continue to curate to its heart's content. But what it can't do is do that while it's owned by China, because we're worried about what China does vis-a-vis TikTok Inc.
Whatever happens, it seems likely that the case is heading to the Supreme Court. And what about a sale? Could that be on the cards? Anupam thinks not. He says it's not as simple as it sounds.
I don't think a sale is possible. I don't think it's actually practicable.
For one thing, the Chinese government can block the sale or transfer of TikTok's secret source, its algorithm, and has said that it will do so. Without that algorithm, the app is substantially less valuable. But as Anupam explains, that's not the only issue.
The application probably falls apart on its own if sold. Now, that sounds like a crazy claim. Why wouldn't TikTok US be as wildly successful as TikTok has been in the past? That the law says you cannot have any ongoing operational relationship between TikTok foreign, TikTok global, and TikTok US.
In other words, structuring the company to appease regulators would be a complex feat. And even if it could be done, it would leave Americans alone on the app, siloed from users from abroad. This still leaves one possible and rather surprising avenue for rescuing the app. Former President and now President-elect Trump. On the campaign trail, Trump seemed to have an about-face on the idea of banning TikTok.
For all of those that want to save TikTok in America, vote for Trump. The other side's closing it up. But I'm now a big star on TikTok.
Since the new ban was enacted through legislation rather than executive order, it's unclear what Trump could do about it, especially since he will assume office the day after the ban is meant to take effect. Maybe he could persuade Congress to repeal the ban. Maybe he could direct the Justice Department not to enforce it. Maybe he could perform some other fancy footwork. Then again, he could just change his mind. Again, when you consider all we've discussed so far, there's a big, glaring irony to this ban that we haven't even gotten to yet.
It seems exactly the opposite of everything that the United States stands for, and it looks alarmingly and ironically much more like the Chinese internet. And so that's exactly what China did 25 years ago. We're just coming onto it 25 years late.
China is notorious for its Great Firewall, an internet censorship system that restricts citizens inside the country from accessing websites from outside. In fact, TikTok itself is not allowed in China. Douyin, TikTok's sister app, also run by ByteDance, is where you'll find Chinese users. The hypocrisy is not lost on Meredith Whittaker either. In fact, she can't help but feel some déjà vu.
I have been very sensitive to the potential for government and corporate weaponization of this kind of power for a long time. I can zoom back 10 years, and I was involved in a number of meetings with the Obama administration, with folks from Google, with the international community, where there was a full-throated defense of a global liberatory internet, a full-throated pushback of what we called the splinter net, which was, effectively pushing back on China for, implementing a great firewall that did exactly what this TikTok ban is doing in reverse, banning US-based companies and data collection.
And she worries that it's a slippery slope because the incentives, well, they're all in one direction.
Are we championing economic supremacy of a US state? To me, I don't care that much about that. Is that our goal? Or is our goal to reshape the tech industry because in its current form, it's toxic for us, it's toxic for them, and it is creating an incredibly dangerous source of power and control that could, without very much effort, be hijacked by, a bad regime.
Consolidating power in the government to choose what apps are safe or unsafe spells a dark future for free speech in America. It's much more than one app at one point in time. If TikTok runs out the clock, it will no longer be available in the Apple or Android stores come January 19, 2025. But Anupam says that there's a much larger consequence.
It will be a black mark for the United States. It will reverberate across the world. There will be literally Americans that are VPNing to access TikTok. And so our kind of shining city on a hill where we allow freedom and we are unafraid of what freedom entails, including access to information, will now seem like a distant memory.
This, of course, has been a theme across the series. The idea of the border being a massive blind spot in America's free speech tradition. At first view, many of the issues we have covered this season, the attempted deportation of immigration activists, invasive device searches, social media surveillance, spyware, and foreign media bans, may seem disparate and hard to connect, but they're actually part of the same story. From the very beginning of this country's history, the government has used the border as a justification and pretext for censorship and surveillance. New technologies have at once diminished the importance of the border and reinforced it. The internet, for instance, makes it easier than ever to share information and ideas across international lines. But as we've seen, changes in technologies also create new opportunities for speech suppression. Unfortunately, the courts have been an unreliable bulwark against these incursions, and it's not clear that that will change anytime soon. But there have been bright spots. People like Adam Habib, Ravi Ragbir,
If I'm afraid to do that, how can other people be willing to stand up?
Akram Shibli, and the journalist at El Faro, willing to stand up for their rights.
We are not frozen out of fear in a corner.
And a community of lawyers that have had their back and sometimes even succeeded in pushing back on the court's rampant border exceptionalism. As Akram Shibli observed in a previous episode, sometimes the fight takes generations.
We're just continually doing this work and going to continue to fight these issues as they come up.
While we conceived of the season long before the 2024 presidential election, the specter of a second Trump administration and the likelihood that it will lean more heavily on the border as a justification for surveillance and censorship makes these conversations all the more urgent. Here at the Knight First Amendment Institute, we'll continue our work to defend the freedoms of speech and the press at the frontiers of censorship and surveillance. I am Ramya Krishnan. I am a lawyer at the Knight First Amendment Institute. Thank you for listening to this season of Views on First. Speech on the Border is co-produced by Anne-Marie Awad and Kushal Dev. Our executive producer is Candice White. Our engineer is Patrice Mondragon. This season, you heard from my colleagues George Wang, Anna Diakon, and Alex Abdo. Kerry DeSalle provided creative direction for this series and is also the lead litigator on some of the cases we discussed. Fact-checking by Roni Gallows, Teddy Weich, and Kushal Dev. The art for our show was designed by Nash Weerasekara. Our theme music was composed by Grayton Newman, with additional music from Epidemic Sound. Views on First is available on Apple, Spotify, and wherever you listen to podcasts. Please subscribe and leave a review. We'd love to know what you think. To learn more about the Knight Institute, visit our website, knightcolumbia.org. That's Knight with a K, and follow us on social media.